Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Superhuman Thinkers podcast brought to you by the Superhuman Company. Throughout the global COVID-19 outbreak, we have been reminded that change is ongoing, plans unravel, and expectations are not always met. The world is experiencing a level of disruption and business risk not seen in generations. Some companies freeze and fail, while others innovate, advance, and even thrive. The difference is resilience. That's why resilience, maintaining equilibrium under pressure, is among the most important skills for leaders at all levels to master. The question is not how can you avoid difficulty and stress, but it's nearly impossible to do. Rather, the question is how do you face it? Developing resilience, it's easy to say, but hard to define and yet harder to do. With our special guest today, we are going to reiterate the imperative, define the components of resilience, and introduce the approaches leaders can take to become more resilient. I'm thrilled to welcome today Dr. Taryn Marie. She is the #1 international expert on resilience in both leadership and life, whose mission is to positively impact the lives of 1 billion people through the concepts of resilience by 2030. She is recognized as a leading global authority on resilience, well-being, mental health by the Washington Speaker Bureau. And Dr. Taryn Marie is also the founder and chief resilience officer of Resilience Leadership Institute. A groundbreaking research on resilience has been showcased in publications such as Forbes, Arianna Huffington's Thrive Global, Leaders, LA Progressive, Wellum Magazine's Women Who Inspire Worldwide, television broadcasts, as well as applications including Happyfied, eMindful, and Powerful Universe. In addition, she's a published author of an interesting book that we will discuss about Flourish or Fold, the 5 practices of particularly resilient people. Dr. Taryn Marie, I'm so glad to have dived into your work. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for your time. I know that you are a very busy person. Where are you joining us from?
I am in the United States on the East Coast, just outside of the city of Philadelphia, if you're familiar with the area, just south of New York.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Taryn Marie, before we go any further, can you tell to our audience a little bit about yourself personally and kind of your journey to where we are now?
Yeah, well, you did such a great job with the bio. I'm not sure that I have much more to add, but what I'll tell you is I grew up in a childhood in the United States where we didn't have the internet, you know, not because we were poor, but because it didn't exist yet. Mm-hmm. And so in our living room, we had a set of Encyclopedia Britannicas on one side of the living room. And then we had a very thick dictionary, Merriam-Webster's English Dictionary. And so I grew up with the idea, as many of us do, that the things that I wanted to know about the world could be looked up, but not looked up on the internet, looked up in the context of these encyclopedias or this dictionary, right? And so I learned about this, you know, concept of resilience. And so when I went to look up what resilience is, or what, you know, how it was defined, it was a circular definition, right? So it was like, to be resilient was to demonstrate resilience, right? Resilience was to be resilient. I thought, you know, gosh, this is something that seems really important. I want to understand more about what this means. And so as I progressed through my school and my schooling and my training, I was doing a pre and post doctoral fellowship in neuropsychology. Mm-hmm. And what we found when patients would come in to the outpatient clinic months or sometimes even years after they'd had a neurological injury, oftentimes people were doing better than we thought, or they were doing worse than their prognosis. And so I wanted to know why. And one of the things that we found in a study where we looked at all different types of data was that people that had access to reliable transportation, meaning people who had access to a vehicle and could drive it, or someone could take them to their appointments. This access to reliable transportation was the difference between getting to live independently after a brain injury or a spinal cord injury and living in an assisted care facility for a prolonged period of time. And so, as we all know, our independence is very important. And so as I transitioned to the corporate world, I thought, okay, we're not all going to have brain injuries or spinal cord injuries. No. And, thank goodness for that. But we all will be no stranger to this experience of challenge, of change, and of complexity. And so I wanted to know, sort of for the rest of us, what was our version of reliable transportation in those moments of challenge? What are the positive and proactive things that we could do? What's the behavior that we could exhibit to create a more resilient outcome? And so that's, led me on the next 15 years of my journey, where, I told you the internet didn't exist when I was young. I mean, I wasn't kidding. So, it's led me on a decade and a half of study of resilience. It's funny, I'll tell you this sort of last bit. I spoke at a women's conference here in the United States. And so I got up on stage last week and I said, I've been studying resilience for 15 months, and then I sort of stopped, and the audience, was looking at me, and I said, you're thinking like you and me both, sister, but I had this sense a decade and a half ago that this concept was going to be really important for us as humans, right? And what's happened in the pandemic as it's come to the forefront. And in some ways, people are even, sort of tired of hearing about resilience, or fatigued in terms of hearing about resilience, I think in large part because we still don't know how to harness it, or many people don't. And so one of sort of the mission that I'm on is to share the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, that empirical framework that's come out of that decade and a half of research. And these are the 5 behaviors that any of us can do in any country and internationally, anytime we face challenge, to create a more positive and productive outcome.
Okay, but I think we will talk about that. But for me, first of all, and for the audience, I would like to know how you can define resilience, because we heard so much also in Europe, in France, you have to be resilient, but what does it mean from your perspective, with your own words?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, we need to be careful, like any sort of positive or meaningful concept, resilience too can be weaponized, right? We can send people the message, hey, you haven't been resilient enough, right? And so we need to be careful about sort of the weaponization of this term, that we don't use it against people. And so the definition that we've developed, or that I've developed over a decade and a half, is simple. And I think it's, there's genius in simplicity, or simplicity in genius. And it's the idea that anytime we face challenge or change or complexity, that we emerge from that moment enhanced for having had that experience, and not diminished. And the definition, I think itself, is important, right? This idea that we're enhanced through challenge, change, and complexity, and not diminished. And it's powerful, I think, in terms of what is not part of the definition, right? So often in definitions, we hear things like quickly recover, how quickly we come back from a challenge, change, or complexity does not indicate our resilience. And in fact, if we return too early, right, if we sort of try to circumvent that process of challenge and growth, it can harm us, rather than help us. Another thing that isn't there is this idea that, we bounce back, right? That's so often synonymous with resilience. And it's actually the greatest myth of resilience, is that we bounce back, because we're fundamentally and forever changed by every experience that we have. And so people come to me and they say, Dr. Taryn, I really feel like I did my best in facing this challenge, and yet I haven't gone back to the way that I was before. And so we get to share with people, no, it's not about being unchanged by our circumstances or bouncing back, right? It's about being changed and enhanced by our circumstances and allowing ourselves to bounce forward.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, resilience is like a little bit our ability to recover from change or hardship, whatever, in the workplace or in life more generally, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, it's interesting. I would not use the word recover in English, because recover too indicates that we're going back to, a prior state. Yeah. I mean, my earliest teachers were my patients and clients with brain injury. And if I ever said to them, recover, I mean, they would get so angry, because they were like, no one goes back to the way that they were before this injury, right? There's a period of rehabilitation, right? But the suggestion that they would go back to the way that they were before was sort of antithetical to them. So, the idea is we're changed by our circumstances. We become new, and through invoking the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, it sort of alchemizes our challenge and allows us to be enhanced by our experience and not diminished.
And from your perspective, why resilience is so necessary for leaders nowadays? What are the benefits for being resilient in the organization, for example, from your perspective?
Yeah, well, I mean, first and foremost, we've asked so much of everyone, in the last 18 months. And, this word leader or leadership or leaders, it's a really interesting term, right? A lot of people will say, well, I'm not a leader. I don't have a team. I don't have, people that report to me.
But you can be leader of your life.
You can be the leader of your life. I love that. I love that. Yeah. Well, when I was at Nike as head of executive development, our mission at Nike was to serve the athlete, right?
Great.
An athlete is a word sort of like leadership, right? Where there's a lot of people who are like, I'm not an athlete, And so we had this little asterisk over athlete, and we said, if you have a body, right, you're an athlete, or you can be an athlete, right? And so I sort of have this little asterisk over leader, and I say, if you have a heart and a mind, right, you are a leader. You can be a leader. To your point, the leader of your life, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So when we sort of think about leadership that way, it's like we've asked a lot of everyone, in these last kind of 15 to 18 months. And so, the first kind of benefit or reason to practice resilience is simply because we've been in a moment of sustained and prolonged challenge, change, and complexity, where we've been responsible not only for ourselves, but for uplifting and up-leveling, right, our teams, our direct reports, our families, our communities. So there's lots of people leaning on us, right? So this idea of like, what are the tools that we can use in this moment of significant challenge, change, and complexity to shore up, right, our ability to not only sustain our own well-being and mental health, but also to be part, a positive element of our community, to carry others.
Okay. And as clear as Peace call to action, maybe how do we develop resilience? And more specifically, where do we start our journey for becoming a resilient leader, for example, or a resilient person? How do we start that? If tomorrow I want to start to become more resilient, what will be your advice from your perspective?
Yeah, well, the good news is you've already started. I say when I do these talks, in keynotes, I say, I'm not going to teach you how to be resilient today, because you already are, right? I mean, this idea is like, challenge in particular, along with change and complexity, these are fundamental elements of the experience of what it means to be human, right? And so often we talk about resilience as like sort of black and white, you know, like either you're resilient or you're not, right? And my belief is that we are all resilient. We all have a certain level of resilience. And then we get to build our resilience over time, like a muscle or like our cardiovascular ability, you know, to train our resilience by facing challenge, change, and complexity. So the good news is we're all already resilient. And then if we want to sort of be on a journey, right, to build that resilience, you know, one of the things that I love about this concept is, you know, I believe that resilience meets us, you know, where we are, right? What does that even mean, right? It means that when we look at kind of these 5 practices, right, we get to determine, and I know we'll talk about them, we get to determine, right, where is a place where I have innate strength where I might want to build, or where is a place where I have opportunity where I also might want to build capability in this area.
Okay. So it's like resilience is about the whole person, as you mentioned. It's not about enough to talk about the brain, but also we need to talk about the heart. And when I foresee when people at work close their hearts and lose empathy and they lose an essential component of their leadership. And from my perspective, high engagement in teams requires passion as well. So it requires people to have an open heart and to express feeling, to be curious about others. And this is very like an emotional vacuum, I think. And I think it's very important to develop that. But I foresee that today's leaders are getting barraged with roadblocks, letdowns, and fail at success. But what we know this to be true, we continue to not to discuss the need for resiliency in corporate organization and institution. Why, from your perspective, why there is such a limitation about resilience, about the corporate world? How do you feel?
You're saying you feel like there's a limitation of resilience in the corporate world?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. On what we have seen in Europe on that extent, we don't talk so much about resilience or how we can develop even more resiliency in the corporate organization and institution as well.
Yeah. What do you talk about instead?
No, I think the try, for example, to help people to find their place, especially during the COVID-19, I think it was really challenging, but they were talking about emotion, about psychological safety. And I don't know from your perspective if there is a link between psychological safety and resilience. Do you foresee some link between them or not?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the link between psychological safety and resilience is that, psychological safety can be that secure base, right? When we feel psychologically safe in an environment or with people, right? To be able to explore our resilience relative to challenge, change, and complexity. Lack of psychological safety can also be a challenge, right? Where we have an opportunity to build, resilience. A lot of studies have been done, when we look at sort of the literature on resilience, it's kind of like 3 types of studies that have been done, right? So one study is looking at children, right? And children growing up in kind of adverse circumstances with lack of psychological safety, with a lot of change, maybe in foster care, right? That kind of thing. And so the studies look at how do those experiences of sort of lack and psychological safety, what is it about sort of the children that in those experiences, become, more resilient, right? Flourish, if you will, and have better outcomes. So psychological safety can be something that promotes, our exploration of resilience. It can also be the challenge itself, right? In which we sort of, meet and build resilience when we don't have a sense of.
Do you foresee from your perspective to create a more resilient team, do you think that developing psychological safety is one of the main ingredients of success from your perspective?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what I'll say is the first practice of particularly resilient people is the practice of vulnerability. Correct. And that oftentimes surprises people because they say, wait, I thought I was supposed to be sort of unmoved or you know, impermeable, impervious to challenge. And so within each of these practices, there's this idea that there's a paradox, right? And the paradox within vulnerability is how do we remain sort of both open in moments of challenge rather than closing down? And how do we allow those moments that can feel like weakness to kind of harness that as our strength, right? In order to demonstrate vulnerability, the first practice of particularly resilient people, we need to be in a psychologically safe environment, right? People don't want to demonstrate a sense of vulnerability if they don't feel safe, right? So psychological safety becomes kind of that precursor, right? That prerequisite in order for us to demonstrate vulnerability as leaders. And vulnerability, the first practice of particularly resilient people, is the cornerstone of then authenticity and empathy, right? And also authentic leadership, empathetic leadership. So to your point, kind of having this, you know, sort of baseline, right, or foundation of psychological safety allows us to be able to practice vulnerability to a greater degree, and then to be even more authentic and empathetic as leaders.
I agree with you, because psychological safety is very important, because I think it's the entry point for belonging, and thus helps to unlock not only well-being, but also resilience and the benefit that diversity and inclusion bring to your team and organization. It also helps to frame the conversation about failure, as you just discussed about that. And I read recently, I don't know if you read that on the New York Times last month, highlighting the vital role leaders play in employee satisfaction and organizational success, and some concrete steps leaders at all levels can take to improve. And before the pandemic, 75% of Americans saw their boss as the most stressful aspect of their job. And I would like to know from your perspective, how should leaders address this psychological safety of employees to make sure that, you know, you can bring this stability within the organization as well? What would be your perspective on that?
Yeah, and just say again, I didn't hear one of the words. Could you ask the question again?
Yeah, I would like to know from your side, how should leaders address this psychological safety of employees? How they need to address that, especially to secure and enhance the sustainable growth within the organization? How do you foresee that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that article in the New York Times was really interesting. What we know that what's been really interesting to a lot of corporations is not just this idea of psychological safety, but also engagement, right? Employee engagement, and also productivity, and how organizations continue to engage employees even in a hybrid or a, you know, remote distributed workforce. And, you know, what Gallup found recently is 70% of employee engagement was based on micro interactions, right? Okay. So not on compensation, not on an expanded, you know, scope of role, not on band or title, right? But 70% of employee engagement is based on micro interactions, right? So I send you an email, the tone of that email, you know, you send me an email back. When I say, gosh, Alan, I'm not having a good day, I'm trying to homeschool my kids, or I'm not feeling well, or I have to go to the doctor, or my dog is sick, how you respond to me in those moments, right? Indicate to me how much you care, how much I can count on you, how psychologically safe I am. And those are the micro interactions that are making up, you know, 70% of employee engagement. And so often we think it's, you know, it's kind of these big moments, right? But it's the small things, and it's the, sort of sustained small or micro interactions that actually, influence our engagement. And so as a leader, right, to go to your question, like, how do we facilitate psychological safety? First and foremost, the people that we work with, we need to be able to communicate that we care deeply.
Correct.
About those people.
The human touch, I would say.
Yeah. And, much has been made of, well, can we do this in a remote environment? We absolutely can do this in a remote environment, right? And so it's about, starting and ending meetings, right, with people in mind, right? Checking in with people, saying, how are you really? And listening to the response. Or if you're in a team environment, going around and doing an exercise like high, low, right? Where everybody talks about, one high for them that they're sort of celebrating or enjoying, and one thing that feels low that they're trying to figure out. And so there's also vulnerability in that, right? So setting up this, kind of stage where our people feel heard, they feel appreciated, they feel cared about, right? And these are the ways that we demonstrate psychological safety.
Correct. I agree. I totally agree with you. And the research that it was mentioning in the New York Times as well was mentioning that job satisfaction is the second most important determinant after mental health of an employee. And this is what you are highlighting as well. But I would like to know from your perspective, can we say that how well a leader cope with stress will it help to determine how resilient he or she is overall? Can we say that?
Can we determine how resilient someone is?
Yes, exactly. Depending on how you collaborate with the stress, if you are very receptive and you can cope with stress, it means that you have this capacity to be more resilient or be resilient as well.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that we need to keep in mind is, all stress is not created equal, right? So, if I'm, driving to work, let's just say, and I get a flat tire, right? That's stressful. If I'm late for an important meeting, that's even more stressful, right? If I'm driving to the hospital and I have a family member that's not well and may even be dying, right? That's even more stressful, right? If I have, so a flat tire can, have lots of elements to it. When we think about stress, there's some really good research that's been done by 𝘧𝘠𝑗sn. It's an older study, 𝑌ERKES-Dodson. Okay. And what they found was, like, stress for people is sort of a normally distributed curve, right? So the relationship between stress and motivation. So there's some stress, right? Then our motivation goes up, and a little bit more stress and our motivation goes up. But when we get to that top of the curve, and this threshold or kind of the top of the curve is different for everyone, right? When we get to the top of the curve, when we layer on more stress, actually then our motivation goes down, right? And so we all have a different threshold for stress, right? And that doesn't mean that we're resilient or not resilient, right? But it has to do with the type of stressor, how stressful we interpret that to be. What feels stressful for me may not feel stressful for you, right? Yeah. And it also means, like, the number and severity of stressors that are happening at the same time, right? It's one thing to be, selling your house, right? It's another thing to be selling your house in the midst of a pandemic, changing jobs with a new baby, right? And so we have to look at sort of the size and number of the stressors that are happening concurrently.
Now we have seen on neuroscience studies have shown that stress is not in of itself physically harmful. Stress reactions such as pounding heart or fast breathing prepare our bodies to meet a threat, for example, and they energize us to act. In fact, they are integral part of this fight or flight response that allow humans to survive dangerous situation. And for good leaders, you need to experience a sense of urgency when their projects are at stake, and momentary stress can help to galvanize individual teams at the critical juncture. So I think the question is mostly what is the right balance between too much worry and not enough worry also as well. But I think you have talked about leaders, what they should do, but what are the big pitfalls leaders and our boards or CEOs should avoid about resilience from your perspective?
Yeah, I'm always careful, anytime we use the word should, to not be too prescriptive.
Okay.
For me, like should's one of those like dangerous words. There's a psychologist, the late psychologist Albert Ellis, who talked, when his clients would say, I should do this or I should do that, and he would say, you're shoulding all over yourself. So, what should people do? I think every day is an opportunity. Correct. Right? And we don't sort of know someone's experience until we've, as we say in the US, like we've walked a mile in their shoes, right? But one of the things that I'm really excited about and I'm really proud of is this idea of the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, because what it does is it gives us a framework for what we can do, right, in these moments of stress or pressure or challenge, change, and complexity. And so what those, 5 things are that people can do, right? First and foremost is engage in vulnerability, right? Be willing to say, I don't know, or I'm not sure how to do this, or, I think the 3 most difficult words to say, at least in the English language, are, I need help, right? We say relative to vulnerability that we get to lean on people and have reciprocal relationships. There's so many people that still believe they constantly have to be the rock, right? And, so I like to say the only insane thing is to be the sane one all the time, right? Like we all get to have moments where we, let our hair down and lean on others, So demonstrating that sense of vulnerability, asking for help, delegating tasks, bringing people in with expertise, realizing we don't have to solve the problem all by ourselves, right? Those are all hallmarks of vulnerability. The second thing is productive perseverance. And what productive perseverance means is it's the intelligent pursuit of a goal. And so that means, we have vision for what we're creating for the future, and we maintain the mission even when we face obstacles. And when we do face obstacles or significant disruptions, knowing when we maintain the mission and when we need to pivot in a new direction.
Correct. Okay.
The third practice that people can engage in is the practice of connection. This is actually one that's, incredibly difficult for leaders. By the time I get to the practice of connection, people are like, okay, vulnerability, that sounds scary, or I didn't know it was associated with resilience. Productive perseverance, that sounds fancy. Intelligent pursuit of goal. Connection, oh my gosh, I've got this one, right? But connection might be the hardest one, because connection is about navigating sort of the paradox of our internal connection with ourselves and the desires and needs and intuition that we have deeply within ourselves, and then how we navigate the relationship with the desires and needs and even demands of our external connections. And what happens for a lot of very senior leaders and for CEOs, and especially for women, is that connection gets out of balance, right? We get so used to being outwardly focused or extrinsically focused that, we're not as connected to ourselves, right? People who spend their whole lives as a CEO building a company, building a product, building a brand, right? We're so focused on that thing, sometimes we stop listening to ourselves. So to rebalance that internal connection with ourselves with the external connection with others.
Yeah, sometimes you forget about yourself. You completely forget about yourself. So
that's right. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The fourth practice is the practice of gratiosity. It means being able to look on a circumstance or a challenge, even if we wouldn't have chosen it, and especially after some time, and to be able to see the good in what occurred, right? And then to be able to share those stories of resilience generously with others, so that others can learn vicariously in mentorship and coaching conversations from our experience. And what's interesting is gratitude is this really sort of fascinating emotion. We know that we can't simultaneously feel grateful and feel angry or anxious or overwhelmed, right? So gratitude becomes this protective emotion that if we want to get into a better mental space, when we practice gratitude, when we start scanning our environment for what's going well instead of what's going wrong, that creates a more resilient mindset and approach to the world, because we're looking for those moments to be grateful, and by definition not engaging in other types of emotions that may not be as productive.
That is what I do personally. I'm doing this grateful moment each end of the week to see and to analyze what I've done great, and also which moment of grateful I'll share with the team as well. I think it's very important also. But
I love that.
I think it's very important. And to prepare for the future, how do you foresee how to re-energize organization for the long run? Because this will be quite highly critical for sustaining as their performance. What do you foresee from your point of view on that extent to re-energize organization, employees? Because after the COVID-19, I think people are like feeling overwhelmed, maybe a limit at the burnout, how they can recharge the battery from your perspective.
Yeah. Well, the fifth practice fits really well here, which is the practice of possibility. And possibility is about sort of navigating the paradox that exists between opportunity and risk, right? And so as we think about our own internal battery or re-energizing ourselves, there's very much this sort of dichotomy of opportunity versus navigating risk. And so we get to ask ourselves, right? What is the opportunity to enhance ourselves, in this moment? And is there any sort of risk that, we want to navigate there? What fits really well with this is this idea of, not only well-being and mental health, but also, how we think about sort of beating back or creating boundaries to avoid burnout, overwhelm and exhaustion.
Correct.
And, this is a concept that I've become really interested in part because, I've experienced it, personally over the course of the last 15 months, where it has got to a point where I didn't feel like I had any energy. I wasn't excited about doing anything. I wasn't productive. I wasn't engaged. And I'm living my life's work, right? So I was like, what's going on, right? And what happens is, I think, sort of the insidious thing about burnout or overwhelm, right, is it sort of sneaks up on us, right? It sort of flies below the radar. So we just think, oh, I missed a couple nights of sleep. Things are going to get better when the kids go back to school. Things will get better when I complete this project, right? It's just that I've missed a couple workouts this month, that kind of thing. And what we don't realize is kind of the full constellation of the stress that starts to pile up until one day we wake up and we're like, I'm really tired. I don't feel like doing anything, right? And so being able to sort of catch ourselves before we're in that moment of like the free fall of burnout and overwhelm, right? And what that means is looking at our daily experience and ensuring that we have things that re-energize us, right? You know, what has happened for me, and I think for so many people, is there's been this like crowding out of pleasurable experiences, right? We couldn't go to coffee shops, we couldn't go to concerts, we couldn't, you know, sort of travel, right? Go out to eat, right? See friends, right? And so not only were we experiencing and do we continue to experience this kind of like stressful, chronic, you know, experience of challenge, right? But then those coping mechanisms or those things that brought us joy weren't available either, right? And so what happened was we had a lot of challenge happening all at once, a lot of ambiguity, and the things that we enjoyed got crowded out or pushed out, right? And so what we need to do is to recognize what are the things, right, that sort of like keep me on track, right? For me, it's like getting enough sleep and doing cardio and getting a workout in. And when I do those two things, you know, I can sort of face a lot of challenge for a prolonged period of time. When I don't do those things, within 48 hours, I become a total mess.
Okay, you feel it personally. Okay.
Everybody around me feels it.
Okay. I think there is a lot more to discuss on that area, but before to let you go, Dr. Mary, I would like to go to a quick fire round, and I'm going to ask you 5 questions. So I'm going to hijack your amygdala or activate your emotional brain for 30 seconds. Okay, no longer than 40 seconds, and you're going to give us some amazing answers. Are you ready?
If you say so.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. Okay. Fire away.
What was the #1 thing that was holding you back from becoming who you are today?
Fear.
Fear. What was your biggest challenge?
Biggest challenge that I faced?
Yes.
Probably having a stalker in my teens and developing 2 decades of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Wow. Okay. What is your favorite book? I know you love book, but you would recommend to our audience. What would be your favorite one?
Born a Crime by Trevor Noah.
Okay. I will share that to the audience as well. What is one thing that you are excited about leadership, about resilience, about your role on that extent?
I think, you know, I believe resilience will continue to be tremendously relevant and the path forward to enhancing ourselves as humans and healing both in leadership and in life.
Okay. Can you please give us your favorite life lesson quote? Tough one, huh?
I like what Maya Angelou said. She said, people won't remember what you said. They'll remember how you make them feel.
I agree. Nice one. Very nice one. And what is the best piece of advice in business you ever received?
Believe in yourself.
And what would be the piece of advice for someone to be a better resilient leader in 2021?
Believe that it gets better.
Wow, thank you so much. And last question, where can our audience connect with you if they want to learn more and obviously follow you? Are you more LinkedIn person, Instagram? What is it the best place to follow you?
I think we have the strongest presence from a followership standpoint on LinkedIn and Instagram right now. You can find me on LinkedIn by my name. At Instagram, it's at Dr. Dr. Taryn Marie, M-A-R-I-E. You can also hit up our company website. It's resilience with a C -leadership.com. We've got lots of good stuff happening there. And you can sign up for our newsletter and become a resilience insider.
But I will share that all of his address to the audience as well. Thanks again for taking your time to join us and share your experience. I really appreciate. We have seen that creating a high-performing and resilient team and organization is really a challenge. And for everyone listening, thank you for your questions. I will forward all to Dr. Marin Terry, but she's going to reply to you on LinkedIn. And also follow Dr. Taryn Mary on Instagram, LinkedIn. She posts great content. And thanks to everyone following this episode brought to you by the Superhuman Company. And I hope you enjoy it. And please like, share, comments, tag colleagues as well. If you don't really follow us, make sure you hit the button on my profile. That way you will be notified whenever we go live or we post new content. Or you can also subscribe to the Superhuman Thinkers podcast on any platform. We are everywhere. So apart from that, Dr. Taryn Mary, thank you so much for your work and for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. And I look forward to doing this again soon. Okay. And take care and have a fabulous rest of the week ahead for all the participants tonight. Thank you so much.